Andrew Windsor is spending his last weeks at Royal Lodge ranting to himself.
Ever-evolving soap opera, that is, of course, what's happening over at Royal Lodge.
The affairs of the royal family tells you that we are living in quite bizarre times.
He's living in disgrace. He was stripped of his royal duties, and part of that is he's not really being paid by the monarchy anymore because he doesn't complete any royal duty.
There's a specific type of silence that follows a man who's lost everything that once made him untouchable. And when Prince Andrew walked back into Windsor Castle recently, that silence greeted him like a slap across the face. The staff who once trembled at the sound of his footsteps now stood perfectly upright, meeting his gaze without flinching. The guards who once delivered crisp salutes looked straight past him as if he were invisible. And the palace employees who spent decades nervously addressing him as Your Royal Highness now took visible pleasure in calling him something that must have felt like acid on his tongue. Mr. Mountbatten Windsor. For a man who built his entire identity on status, deference, and the fear he commanded in others, this wasn't just embarrassing. This was the complete dismantling of everything he believed made him superior to ordinary people. But that humiliation was only the beginning of what's now spiraling into the most devastating exposure of his entire scandal-plagued existence. Prince Andrew has already lost his military titles, his royal patronages, his public role, and whatever shreds of dignity he still possessed after the Jeffrey Epstein scandal exploded into global headlines. But what he's being stripped of now cuts deeper than any ceremonial honor or official position ever could. He's losing something he valued more than medals or ribbons, or even his place in the line of succession. He's losing respect, the old-fashioned royal deference that once shielded him from consequences and allowed him to operate as if normal rules simply didn't apply to someone of his breeding. According to reports from palace insiders, when Andrew made his first return to Windsor Castle since King Charles revoked his titles, he walked in expecting the usual choreography of submission that had defined his entire life within those walls. He anticipated bows, nods, averted eyes, and that particular brand of anxious deference that powerful men mistake for genuine respect. What he encountered instead was a cultural earthquake. Staff members who once nervously made themselves small in his presence now stood at full height. Guards who previously snapped to attention now barely acknowledged his existence. Palace employees who'd been trained to treat him like royalty now addressed him with the same neutral politeness they'd show any civilian walking through for a tour. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't the result of poor training or staff forgetting protocol. This was deliberate. This was King Charles sending an unmistakable message through the most powerful language the monarchy understands, symbolic gesture. By instructing staff that Andrew no longer deserves the traditional markers of royal status, Charles essentially declared his brother a commoner within the very institution that once elevated him above reproach. For Andrew, who spent his entire existence believing his birth entitled him to permanent superiority, this represented something worse than public scandal. This was private humiliation witnessed by the very people he'd once bullied and belittled. But the indignities didn't stop at lost salutations and abandoned honorifics. Andrew discovered that another privilege he'd taken completely for granted had been abruptly terminated. His personal meal delivery service from Windsor Castle kitchens is finished. For years, Andrew apparently enjoyed what insiders describe as a royal food delivery service, where meals prepared at Windsor Castle would be sent directly to him at Royal Lodge, his current residence. Staff have now been explicitly instructed to discontinue this service entirely. If Andrew wants lunch, he needs to figure it out himself or depend on whatever Sarah Ferguson manages to prepare between her various business ventures and publicity appearances. For someone who spent 7 decades expecting others to cater to his every need, both literally and figuratively, this seemingly small change carries enormous weight. It's not really about food. It's about the monarchy officially treating him like he's outside the system, no longer deserving of the small daily luxuries that come with being part of the working royal machine. The message couldn't be clearer. You're not special anymore. You don't get preferential treatment, and you're expected to manage your own basic needs like everyone else in the country. For Andrew, whose entire identity was built on being the exception to every rule, this is devastation disguised as mundane logistics. This sudden transformation in how Andrew is treated isn't happening in a vacuum. For decades, he was notoriously difficult with palace staff. Former employees have spoken openly about his volcanic temper, his complete lack of gratitude, and the way he barked orders without acknowledging the humanity of the people serving him. There are documented accounts of him shouting his infamous catchphrase, "Hurry up," at staff members who dared to walk at anything less than a sprint when he wanted something. Stories circulate about him demanding instant service for everything from pressing his trousers to arranging last-minute international flights on the taxpayer's dime. Former palace employees recall that if anyone forgot to bow deeply enough or failed to use his preferred forms of address, he would glare with barely contained fury, deliver lectures about proper respect, or complain to their supervisors to ensure they were disciplined. He created an atmosphere of fear and resentment that festered for years beneath the surface of royal protocol. So when you consider that history, you begin to understand why some of those same staff members aren't just tolerating the new protocol. They're actively enjoying it. After decades of being treated as lesser beings, they're finally free to stand tall, make eye contact, and address him as just another private citizen. For them, this isn't a minor adjustment. This is liberation. It's tempting to dismiss all of this as petty drama about titles and meal deliveries. But within the specific culture of royal institutions, these symbolic gestures carry extraordinary power. The entire structure of monarchy is built on symbolism, on the visual language of hierarchy and deference. Once those symbols are systematically removed, the power they represented evaporates. Andrew has been desperately attempting to reinsert himself into royal life ever since Queen Elizabeth died. He hoped Charles would soften his position over time. He hoped his daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, would successfully lobby the palace to preserve at least a few of his privileges. He hoped public outrage would fade as other scandals captured attention. None of those hopes materialized. Andrew's fundamental problem is his complete inability to let go of the past. He continues behaving as though he remains royalty, despite the monarchy very deliberately stripping him of that identity. He still insists he did nothing wrong despite overwhelming evidence and worldwide condemnation. He still expects sympathy, even though his arrogance and catastrophically poor judgment are the direct reasons he's in this predicament. And he still clings desperately to Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion he refuses to vacate. Despite King Charles making it abundantly clear he wants Andrew relocated to something far less grand. Andrew cannot adjust to his new reality, which means every interaction becomes a painful reminder of what he's lost. So when he walks into Windsor Castle and staff refuse to bow, it's not merely socially awkward. It's psychologically destabilizing. Public humiliation is one form of punishment, but private humiliation, the kind witnessed by people you once commanded and intimidated, that cuts infinitely deeper. Reports now indicate that Andrew and Sarah Ferguson have been explicitly told they are not welcome at the royal family's Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. Instead of participating in the traditional royal holiday gathering, Andrew is being pushed toward relocating to a private property on the Sandringham estate, one of the more remote and isolated royal holdings. This move is scheduled to happen as soon as practicable, likely shortly after Christmas or in early 2026. King Charles has made his position unmistakably clear. There is no path back into royal life for Andrew. There was a time when Andrew played the role of high-ranking royal, with confidence bordering on arrogance. He met world leaders, strutted around royal estates with smug self-assurance, and was known throughout palace circles for his temper and endless demands. Today, he's been reduced to being called Mr. in the childhood home, where he once wielded unchecked authority. The contrast between who he was and who he's become is so stark it almost defies comprehension. But here's where the situation transforms from embarrassing to potentially catastrophic. Forget the ongoing disputes about housing and titles for a moment. The most shocking recent development involves the release of new emails exchanged between Andrew and members of Jeffrey Epstein's inner circle. These communications are nothing short of devastating to whatever remained of Andrew's credibility. In these messages, Andrew isn't the calm, composed royal he attempted to portray during his disastrous television interview. He's frantic, panicked, and completely overwhelmed by the scandal engulfing him. At one point in the email correspondence, Andrew writes something that reveals everything about his actual state of mind. "I can't take any more of this." Those 7 words tell you everything you need to know about a man who spent decades posing as confident and untouchable, now reduced to desperate pleading. The emails show him begging for statements to be drafted on his behalf, insisting he knew nothing about Epstein's criminal activities, demanding his name be removed from anything that might link him to the growing list of accusations and victims. This completely contradicts his long-standing public position that he had decisively cut ties with Epstein years earlier. Not only does the correspondence prove the relationship remained active well into the period when Epstein's crimes were becoming public knowledge, it shows Andrew was deeply involved in crisis management. He was coordinating responses, he was pleading for protection, and he was clearly terrified of what might be revealed. For someone who once projected an image of invincibility, having his own written words expose that fear represents perhaps the most humiliating twist in this entire saga. These aren't allegations or accusations that can be denied or dismissed. These are his own messages, in his own words, revealing the panic behind the public facade. These emails fundamentally changed the entire narrative of the Andrew scandal. Until now, the palace could maintain a position that he was simply a disconnected former royal who made poor choices in his associations, but had genuinely stepped away from that world. The email correspondence destroys that carefully constructed defense. They reveal a man who remained deeply entangled, still communicating with the very people he claimed to have distanced himself from, still strategizing about how to manage the fallout, still desperately trying to protect his reputation, even as the walls closed in around him. His polite public insistence that he barely knew these individuals, that he'd moved on completely, was pure theater. And the moment those emails surfaced, the public finally got to see the truth behind the performance. A man in absolute panic, frantically trying to prevent his complete destruction, begging others to save him because he could no longer save himself. It reveals not just a fallen royal, but someone who knew the fall was inevitable and was desperately scrambling to minimize the impact. The tone of his messages tells a story his carefully managed public statements never could. The monarchy has worked tirelessly to close this chapter. Titles stripped, roles eliminated, homes being surrendered, public appearances erased from royal calendars. Yet the one element they cannot control is the documentary evidence. These emails are precisely what the palace most feared. They reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. They reignite questions about who knew what and when, and they create the terrifying possibility that even more damaging material might still be hidden somewhere waiting to surface. For Andrew personally, the impact is absolutely brutal. His already shattered reputation has sustained another devastating blow. Public sympathy, which was already non-existent, has turned into active contempt. Even within royal circles where loyalty typically trumps accountability, the patience has completely evaporated. For the monarchy as an institution, the concern is existential. If this is what has emerged so far, what else might still be out there? What other communications exist? What other evidence might surface in civil lawsuits or criminal investigations? The fear of unknown revelations keeps the palace in a state of perpetual crisis management. Fresh allegations continue circulating about Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's involvement in Epstein's network of exploitation. The connections between Andrew and Virginia Giuffre, who was 17 when she alleges Andrew abused her on 3 separate occasions, remain in public consciousness despite his denials. The famous photograph of Andrew with his arm around the teenage Giuffre has become an indelible image that no amount of public relations can erase his attempts to explain away that photograph. To suggest it might be fabricated only made his position less credible. So here we are, watching a former royal stripped of every privilege and protection. now exposed in private communications that reveal a fundamentally different person than he presented to the world. Not the confident, self-assured figure who once commanded respect through fear and status, but someone frantic, frightened, and begging to escape consequences of his own creation. These emails represent a genuine turning point. They redefine his legacy from disgraced royal to something darker and more desperate. They expose the gap between his public denials and his private panic. The question now isn't whether Andrew can somehow rehabilitate his image or find his way back into royal life. That ship sailed long ago and is never returning to port. The real question is whether the monarchy can distance itself quickly enough and completely enough to avoid being permanently associated with his scandal. King Charles is trying to excise his brother from the royal body like a surgeon removing a tumour, but the damage may already be too deep. The institution that once shielded Andrew now treats him as toxic waste that must be carefully contained and eventually disposed of. The palace staff standing upright instead of bowing, the cancelled meal service, the exile to remote properties, the exclusion from family gatherings. These aren't random acts. They're a coordinated campaign to demonstrate that Andrew no longer belongs, that he's been expelled from the only world he's ever known. And those emails, frantically typed by a man watching his entire life collapse, they're the documentary evidence that his exile was always deserved, that the protection he received for decades was never earned, and that justice, however delayed, is finally being served through systematic humiliation and permanent disgrace. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.